Here we are further up in the Widden Brook, and this is the classic Australian stream. Nice grassy bank, sandy bed, and the casuarinas growing down the edge. What happened in this last flood that came through here, about 2.5 metres of water, was that a large amount of material was washed down, and it wasn't held in this part of the landscape. Up there on the floodplain, there's no sandy slugs, there's no even humus and vegetable matter held. It all came shooting straight down through the stream bed here, and you can see these sand slugs coming through in bunches. The casuarinas, some of them have been toppled over like those couple there, and behind them there's been a slug of sand caught. And if we look lower down, we can see that underneath these casuarinas, they started to get a little bit undercut with the stream, and lower down the bank is starting to get eaten out and undercut, and this material was all basically flowing down through the stream system. As we're walking along on that floodplain there, it's still the hard compacted soil of ancient floods, but this 1 in 100, 1 in 50 year flood didn't actually get up onto that old floodplain. From here on down, it did. It got slowed down by the in-stream structures and trees and spread out onto the floodplain. Yes, it knocked over some fences, but boy, did it lift the nutrient level in that floodplain. And Paul, the manager here, has told us that there's an unbelievable increase in nutrients in his floodplain, and he's really happy with that. So Paul, across these flats here, the floodwaters have risen up and flooded out across the flats here. What's the positive and negative things that you've seen happen?
Oh, it's obvious the water has come out across these flats, and in doing so it's dropped a huge amount of silt, which is fantastic fertiliser for us. It's built up the creek beds in these areas. You can see from looking out into the creek how the trees and what vegetation's there has caught all the silt and the branches and etc. which has sort of risen the creek, which has probably helped push the water out even more.
Yep. And so the good bit is that you've got now this nutrients across these flats. The bad bit is you lost some fences.
Sure, it's we can rebuild the fences. It's very hard to rebuild degenerated soil. Okay, it's much easier to rebuild a fence.
Yeah. Here we are below one of the structures that some people might say has failed. But the interesting things to note is where that structure is just above us here, that has allowed these casuarina trees to grow. It allowed the bulrushes to start growing in the stream bed. And you can see them there, and they've actually caught material. A little bit is washed out in the middle. But in essence, this whole floodplain here and creek bed have remained intact with a flood that was well over my head here, and was up to 4 metres deep, raging down there. So we're seeing here a system that is slowly building itself up, capturing nutrients, and these trees that have survived this 1 in 50 year flood are now going to grow up, and we'll get the next stage of growth, and the next flood that comes along will be slowed down even more, and will go out even further onto the floodplain. The soil I'm walking on here is a thick grass, a kikuyu, and it's caught tons and tons of sand and silt, and it's very spongy underfoot. So all this that we're walking on here has been built up during this flood, and in the base of the Widden Brook there, it's only large stones that are there. So that was quite a raging torrent down through the middle there. So the interesting thing to note from this structure is not only is it having an effect downstream, but upstream, where we were having the classic shifting sand down the middle of the Widden Brook. If you look closely, you can see that it's got a lot more of this silt in it. The sand's going darker and blacky colour up there. And so this settling pond has allowed nutrients to be deposited in that sand as well, which is then going to allow plants to start growing above the structure, as well as what we've seen below with the casuarinas developing there as a result of the positive and negative pressure structures. Here we are at what we call the stilling ponds. You might remember them from the last video of Peter showing where water came onto water to create a nice still pond. And yes, there was a lot of lush vegetation here before, and that's washed away. This tree was looking quite healthy and has taken a bit of a battering. But the effects are still there. We're seeing behind me here a large amount of vegetation and silt caught, and that's going to feed. And already we're seeing in amongst the rocks here little plants germinating, and this will soon be a mass of weeds. The water's been slowed down enough to catch large amounts of vegetable matter, the silt fines, and the water was pushed out onto that floodplain there, and there's a vast amount of sand has been dumped there as a result of this structure slowing the water down enough to let that sand settle out. So as a result of this structure, the casuarinas have been allowed to grow here. Again, we've got the water higher than here, and so there's that positive negative pressure. Here it's a positive pressure, and that allows these casuarinas to have grown, and they've withstood. The water's been up 2 metres here above us. And we can see on the other side there the willows have captured vast amounts of some large vegetable matter, and then behind there's nearly 2 metres of sand and silt have been caught in amongst those willow trunks. So here we are below the stilling ponds, and we can see the structure there in the background, and the effect of that has caught these massive amounts of dead leaf litter, humus, charcoal, and then below that sand. And in the base of the brook here we can still see the water plants coming up through it. So the whole structure's now building up, and those willows have created the start. And then as we go down, the casuarinas can then come in behind them. And Pete, actually there's a casuarina growing right in the middle of all that now. And that's going to come out up and start dominating that little island. So here we are just below that section there where Peter and I were looking at all the large water plants that were growing in the brook. And as a result of his system there slowing the water down, it's allowed it to flood back out onto this floodplain. And you can see it was running right out across this floodplain here, nearly 1 metre high. The first fence here has caught a lot of coarse vegetable matter, finer vegetable matter on the second fence, and back out across that floodplain there is a rich black humus that's been layered right across those floodplains there. And there, what Paul's talking about, his horses can now utilise the nutrients from that deposited vegetable matter, feeding his grass and giving his horses the ability to get all of the 84 different nutrients that we should be using, and not the 5 that you get out of a bag. When I was here with Peter Andrews on the 1st of May 2007, we were looking here at a big pond. The vegetation was holding it all together. Since then, a massive flood's come through. You can see by this willow here, the water was well up here. The pond is still there. A bit of sand has developed in the bottom of the pond, but we've now created a pond, riffle pond, and you can see the structures here are still basically there. The water weeds and plants are still growing in the base and around the pond, and the casuarinas here on the side, even though they're they're weeping into the water, they're still all holding the bank together. Where I'm standing here, the water had come across here, and there's a fine silts and clays have been deposited here. We're getting back into a braided stream, pond, riffle, pond situation rather than a sandy, moving, shallow stream that we've seen above and below the structures that Peter's put in here. You might remember Peter and I standing here on the 1st of May, looking back up through the creek here, and no water had come through the system at that stage, and we're amazed the next morning that the water came through. We'd fought our way through all the growth that had happened as a result of Peter's structures. Since then, there's been a huge flood. They had 200+ mils in 12 hours on top of a week of heavy rain before that. 2 to 3 metres of water came down through the system, and we've just been through it. Most of it's intact. Below it is a very different story. Starting here, this giant casuarina tree, perhaps 150 years old, has taken a dive. And you might remember as we looked downstream, Peter was saying all that sand that was there would get washed away in the next flood. He's a bit of a guru, he was right. The sand has definitely washed away, and exposed now in this section below us are trees that were knocked over and buried in the 1950 floods. 2 metres of sand has been washed away. Parts of the floodplain have been washed away. Vast amount of our resources have been washed downstream, down into the Goulburn River and down into Maitland and out to sea. Above it, Peter's systems have been holding that nutrient, holding that sand. Here, you can clearly see what happens if you don't put in the right structures, if you don't start to understand the systems that Australia had developed, holding nutrients, building up the landscape. Lower down you can see some structures that were put in by the catchment authorities, those willows, to try and protect the banks. Right where they are, they've probably done their job, but this whole creek bed has dropped and washed away in this last flood. Giant casuarinas have toppled over and into the base of the creek. The skeleton of this tree will slowly get buried, and in the next major flood will be exposed like the skeletons we see below us, unless we start to incorporate Peter's techniques here and start to build up the system, capturing the nutrients, holding the sand and slowing the water down. These structures here were put into the Widden Brook after the 1950s floods that gouged the whole system out and head walls moved up. The banks of the brook were getting eaten and moving out onto the floodplain. So a very expensive system of railway tracks were put in, heavy cables, mesh, and the good old willow was used to hold and capture silt behind that and protect that bank. And they've been very, very successful. However, by not understanding the whole dynamics, if we look back up there, we're looking back up towards where we just were. And 3 months ago, Peter was saying that area, which was all covered in 2 metres of sand, would wash away in the next flood. And it sure has. Exposed here are old trunks from trees that fell into the brook back in the 50s. This section here shows the urgency of the problem. When we were here in May, that grassy bank there joined right across to the grassy bank behind me. And this one flood, 3 days, all of this soil and all of this valuable bit of Australian landscape got washed down and out to sea. Also, the 2 metres of sand that was in the river base got washed away. This is why Peter's so excited about understanding the landscape now, because at the moment we might be in a drought, but soon we'll go back into a wet period and all our rivers could end up looking like this. Denuded, washed away. We're down here at the bottom of the Widden Brook, a kilometre from where it joins the Goulburn River. Last May when I was down here with Peter Andrews, this was just a sandy base. At least now, after the flood, there's water flowing through. A little bit of sand has been caught on these inner floodplains. But the main floodplain, which we see behind us there, behind that 5-6 metres wall of soil, didn't get any of that floodwaters. So that soil up there didn't get any of the nutrients that we saw up on Baramul. It's still devoid of it, and it's still being leached out into the river. Still looks quite idyllic. But all the nutrients from this area have washed down the river and out to sea. You note here it's a shallow waterway, not those deep ponds and riffles like we saw that Peter had created up this top. So when the water does start to dry out, this will disappear very quickly into the sands. No deep ponds to hold water for the stock, fish.